What do we mean when we create an objective measure? Well, it means we actually have an object that we're using as a standard, a stick. And then I compare that stick with everything else and I say, look, this other thing's 2 sticks long, it's half a stick long. I have an objective measure. And so in physics, which is, I think, the epitome of science that everything should be compared to, it's where really the scientific method we're talking about comes from. Um, the standard things that have been found to have objective measures of this kind, where you can create an object to use as a standard, are distance, time, and mass. And basically all the physical quantities, if not concepts, are told in terms of those measurable quantities. But you could be scientific about anything you can measure. So even in psychology, there's scientists, people that are trying to study psychology scientifically by turning it into objective measures. Sure, people might be subjective, but the way we measure their behavior could be objective. So if you could measure love, for example, if the love that Cleopatra had for Caesar is one love unit, you can measure, with some accuracy, some determinacy, how much your love for your spouse was compared to that. It was double, it was half. Then, that could be made a scientific thing. Now that is the scientific method, this intentional back and forth where you start with an extension, you try to describe it, and then you try to challenge your description with it over and over, always only using the most consistent experiences that are measured. And the second thing is that they have to be repeatable. So the perceptions that you make all of these extensions on, and therefore affects what intentions you come up with, they all have to be measurable and repeatable. That makes it the scientific method. Now, all this stuff you hear in science class about the scientific method of, you have to come up with a hypothesis first. No. The hypothesis is the intentional side of things. You can come up with that. However, as a materialist, I'm sure that ultimately the reason you came up with it was something to do with the material world. But it doesn't really matter if it came in a dream, if you did it before the experiment or after, because really by my model, in a sense, it's always going to be after experiments. Because when you collected these ideas as an extension, it probably did affect doing it in the real world. You didn't just think of apples, you picked apples and you ate them, and that's how you created this idea. You've been interacting with those things, and that's experiential. What makes an experiment in the scientific method, as a lot of people talk about it, is how careful it is, and the fact that what we do is we set it up so that there's something to measure and that it's repeatable. Because something to measure means creating perceptions, and repeatable means I can have the perception again and somebody else can have it again, of perception of the experiment running and coming out a certain way, with certain perceptions as a result. So that's what makes something scientific. And, the idea that, you should do a hypothesis first and last and these things. Well, they've shown that, Newton, for example, is the one that created a list like that of how you should go. And, he didn't actually operate that way. There is inspiration. People do things out of order. They do an experiment with one intention, find something weird, that creates a hypothesis. But according to the scientific method, it still works in the sense that the scientific method just starts paying attention right there. Okay, now you've created a hypothesis. Now redo the experiment, probably changing a little bit to fit the hypothesis and test it in particular. So why does all this work? Well, because reality is our stream of perceptions. We don't know if when our foot gets crushed by a stone, if we're just dreaming that or not. It doesn't matter. We do know we have pain. We know what the perception result of it is. This process, the scientific process, is just a careful, skeptical process whereby we look at the perceptions and we see how perceptions behave. So we learn things like when you drop a rock, it's going to hurt your foot. And we learn things like that's because it's destroyed the system, the biological system in your foot, and you have ways of detecting that. And we can learn, and here is how we fix your foot. All because all we're studying is perceptions. Again, we don't know if it's really true in this correspondent, objectivist way. Like, again, maybe it's a dream. But who cares if it's a dream? It's the way these things are working. These things what? The real world that we want to be external? Fine, want that. Really, we're pretending to want to know about a world because of the metaphors we use. And what we really want to know is how things behave. We can find that out entirely from the perceptions. Science is a very careful study of an individual's perceptions, right? That's the whole repeatability thing. So that even though multiple people have this scientific view, the real point, the reason it works is because it can convince an individual. An individual has to be somewhat of a scientist and to be able to do this, but then they can run an experiment. Now, I'm no scientist, but even as a science student, we're made to run a lot of these experiments, and we can see for ourselves, oh yeah, a feather falls at the same rate as this other weight in a vacuum. We can see this stuff for ourselves. That is the power of science, is that it works for an individual because of the repeatability. So if just an individual repeats their experiments, they already have an access to science without sharing it. Now, there is something about intersubjectivity, and what if I have a problem with my eyes, so I'm misreading my measuring stick all the time? Well, I'll find that out when I compare with the results of another person. That's another issue entirely, really, how we get that information. As far as the scientific method, it can work with an individual. It does work with an individual. It also works in a collaborative kind of sense. It sort of normalizes the two by putting requirements on perceptions that both individuals and groups can, adhere to and share, and show that they've adhered to. And it works well because it's a study of what defines working in the first place, whatever predicts a flow of perception. So that's my subjectivist